You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Klein.
To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. On today's episode, we will be talking about this.
She made it through completely unscathed, not an even tiny little bruise on her body. You can't constantly center your own, lived experiences. You're not there to, center yourself in every drama. If you have an opportunity to strike a blow against Wall Street and the massive inequality and suffering that it causes, you don't have the right to refuse to do that because you're, angry and irritated by one of your colleagues. That's not what you're there for. That's what high school is for.
That, of course, is Glenn Greenwald making fun of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for her experience of surviving the fascist insurrection on January 6th. Andrew and I will be joined once again by Andrew Clark, and we will be talking about Glenn Greenwald, about sexism in the left, and about many other things. But first, as we do in every episode, before we get to our main segment, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events. So we're going to talk today in our current events section about the fallout or the aftermath of Trump's second impeachment acquittal, where things, I guess, lie now in the struggle against Trumpism. Andrew, what are your sort of opening thoughts here?
I think it's now very, very clear that the root problem is not Trump himself. He's a symptom, nor, McConnell and the Republicans in Congress. It's the Republican base. And so even people who would want to break with Trumpism, like obviously McConnell wants to because he acquitted Trump and then denounced him up and down the moment the thing was over. Even people who would want the party to break with Trumpism cannot do it without just putting in a wedge that splits the Republican Party in two. Would probably be split in two anyway.
And the Republican senators that did manage to vote to convict him are facing all sorts of backlash, and they were the rare breed of Republicans that had this or that. Pat Toomey's not running for re-election. They have particular circumstances that allow them to have a little more freedom of movement or freedom of opinion, a little bit of insulation from the mob that most Republicans don't have.
Right. They could get away with it. Nonetheless, the vast majority of them in the House and in the Senate who went with the Democrats instead of with the Trumpites, the vast majority of them have been censured by their local Republican structures. That shows you where the base of a Republican Party is at. They are basically either embracing or are comfortable with fascist insurrection against the government of the United States and against, any form of democracy here.
There has been a call to have a 9/11 style commission to investigate the Capitol riot. There are potential civil suits, I think, pending against Trump and some of his conspirators. And there might even be other legal recourse to take against Trump and Giuliani and some of his co-conspirators. So there's those potential things in the works. And then there's also the ongoing FBI investigation into all the terrorists who were involved in the Capitol riot.
And the defamation suits against the people who were claiming that the voting machine companies were rigging the election, or at least had stuff that would allow the election to be rigged. I think those are not unimportant.
Yeah, and the Georgia investigation into Trump's election interference.
Yeah, everybody keep your eyes on Georgia. It's hugely important because it's a criminal investigation, and you've got a black woman prosecutor and basically all of the other structures within Georgia politics, Georgia government that could be dealing with this issue. They can't because they're witnesses or whatever. So her office is the only independent one, and she does not look like she's going to back down here.
Yeah, and supposedly she's considering RICO charges, Rackets Hearing charges.
It's clear that because of the Republican base being down with Trumpism, immovable despite everything that they've done, storming the Capitol, insurrection. There's not going to be any merely political resolution of this issue. The only way to fight this now is, well, to try to do everything I think the Democrats are doing to try to widen the divisions in the Republican Party. But yeah, the issue was going to the courts, and I think obviously we need a mass movement to fight the white nationalism, domestic terrorism that it's fostering. But also, for the first time, the national security establishment seems to want to go after white supremacists, and they're doing that in a big way, picking up the insurrectionists of January 6th. I mean, most recently, the son, grandson, nephew of all kinds of big-name conservative people going way back, L. Brent Bozell, who was there among the insurrectionists, he's been picked up and charged. So he's like, his father is a big conservative guy. His grandmother, I guess it was, or something, was William F. Buckley's wife. Something like that. This is not just like your average deplorables. These are big-name Republican deplorables who we already know are involved, and investigation could really uncover a lot of scorpions under a lot of rocks.
So there are some people on the left who are hesitant to support, although, and that's not like the FBI is looking for their support, but hesitant to support or voice approval of the FBI doing anything because of the history of the FBI targeting and undermining left organizations. You noticed some of this on social media recently in response to some things MHI has posted. What do you make of that?
Well, I think people are applying an old template. Basically, okay, we had this big national security crisis around 9/11 almost 20 years ago, and it was allegedly against Al-Qaeda, but really was used against Muslims, and even the left had to worry. So we can't give in to the national security establishment, which is our enemy, and national security concerns. And they are concerned about the possible passage of a new domestic terrorism law. The problem is when you're facing this immediate problem where what's at issue immediately is not the passage of a domestic terrorism law, but the feds investigating, and when they find something that can be prosecuting against white nationalist domestic terrorism, are you going to condemn this? Are you going to side with the white nationalist domestic terrorists against the government here? And that seems to me to be just bonkers.
Like the FBI right now is not establishing new precedents in terms of their powers of investigation, or laws aren't being passed. They're just exercising their existing powers. And instead of targeting Muslims or Black Power organizations, they're targeting neo-Nazis and the Proud Boys and QAnon people because they realize that that's the real existential threat in our country.
Right. The FBI does not have the power to pass laws. Okay, they can only apply the existing laws, right?
It's not like after 9/11 when there's some new precedent being set in which, like, we have to worry about some slippery slope. It seems like good news. It's the first time that the FBI that I can remember is actually going after the bad guys. Well, I wouldn't say the only time. That's not fair. I mean, the FBI also tracks down people who are involved in child sex trafficking and serial killers and stuff, right? So they don't just target the left.
They should go after the Jews with their space lasers.
So I'm encouraged to see them going after these people, and I wish they were more aggressive going after these people. And I'd love it if they were able to track down all the links to local police departments.
Yeah, and their information, helps members of the public who want to fight white nationalism and domestic terrorism. And in fact, it's the latter who've been providing a good deal of the intelligence to the intelligence services. And it's working. A lot of people are being outed. Like in the case of this L. Brent Bozell, the fourth guy. I mean, he was like a sports coach, basketball or something, at a Christian academy near Hershey, Pennsylvania. And the Christian academy says, well, we as an academy have no political position in this matter, and we're going to cooperate with the authorities. So anything that can drive wedges and disorganize these people and cause some of them to turn on the other ones and become informants, and that's happening, within like the Proud Boys, for instance. That is all to the good, because people say, well, they're not going to go away, but they can be forced more and more underground, and that definitely helps to slow the recruitment efforts. But I tell you, the thing is big. It's all over. This is not just some crackers in the South. This stuff runs deep. These people are all over, and without passing any new laws, just the application of the existing laws, there's a shitload that can be done to help ameliorate this problem. Only social revolution is going to get rid of this problem in the end. Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for this current events section. Up next, our discussion of Glenn Greenwald. Okay, so today on Radio Free Humanity, we are welcoming back Anja Clark, whose voice everyone will recognize as the organizational secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. She reads our Who We Are statement on every episode, and she has been on many episodes over the past year and a half or so. So welcome back, Ann.
Thank you very much.
Today we're jumping into the fray and discussing what has been somewhat of a hot topic in the left in the past few weeks, and that was journalist and so-called leftist Glenn Greenwald's attack on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A lot of people have been talking about the sort of blatant misogyny of his criticism of her. And we want to not just repeat what others have said about the topic, but maybe offer some unique perspectives to the issue. So, Ann, maybe even before we summarize what happened, do you want to just briefly tell us what made you think this would be a good topic for us to talk about, or what, surprised or struck you about what happened?
Well, it's incredible that all these years after the start of the women's movement, more than 50 years ago, that we can have such blatant misogyny still passing for leftism. Many of us don't think that Glenn Greenwald is a leftist at all, but something else that we'll discuss. But the fact that this could be treated seriously by people is indeed shocking. Also, I want to make sure everybody knows what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, because it's very important.
So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as she is known, got a lot of attention for an Instagram video she posted on February 1st after the Capitol riot. Do you want to maybe summarize that, Ann?
Sure. She put out on her Instagram a video of her speaking about what happened to her on January 6th and the insurrection. And she spoke very eloquently and movingly, describing her fear as she ran from place to place looking for a place to hide. And she feared for her life. And she eventually took refuge in the office of Katie Porter, where she hid in a bathroom, barricaded herself in. Porter and her aides barricaded the doors. And she spent hours in terror before they were rescued. And when she describes all this in the video, she spoke about her fear in very real terms. And I think it was afterwards, after she was attacked for this, then she said that she had been the victim of a sexual attack in the past, and this brought that back, and all she could think was not again, not again. In other words, she wasn't going to let it happen to herself again. I think she meant without fighting to the death. But the point is that this added, I think, an important dimension to all the discussion of what happened on January 6th, because she was so detailed and eloquent and sincere, of course. It's stupid that you have to say that. But when a woman says she's afraid of physical attack of any kind, she's so often still in this day and age disbelieved. So then when she got attacked by Glenn Greenwald and other people, it was very hurtful for women in general, okay? And
everything that AOC says, the right wing just freaks out, because she's like the new Hillary Clinton, and they just want to use her as a punching bag. So she can't say anything without getting all this schoolyard ridicule. So there's been all this back and forth of people trying to say that, she was making things up and she was exaggerating but a lot of that was coming from the right. But I think Anne's right that it was then surprising to see so-called leftists like Glenn Greenwald jumping on the bandwagon and also using her as like a punching bag for him to make some kind of point that he was pathetically trying to make. But let's just roll some tape of Glenn Greenwald talking so people can get the idea. Here he is on the Jimmy Dore show, and the context is he's talking about the fallout politically of GameStop's shares being driven up by Redditors.
This week has been like the most amazing week of having the left and the right unite against Wall Street. Almost everybody across the spectrum supports what those Redditors are doing and is thrilled to see these hedge fund leeches suffering. And it's created a major opportunity to regulate, to legislate, to reform. And Ted Cruz, whatever you think of him, reached out by saying, I agree with AOC about this. So that was an opportunity for right and left to join together to do something that supposedly her main reason for existing as a political figure, which is fighting income inequality. And instead she turns around and says, fuck you, I don't want to work with you. You guys got me murdered. You're a white supremacist. And suddenly the two camps divide again. And over here you have the red team and over here you have the blue team cheering like morons at a fucking high school football game again because she ruined that movement because all she wants to do is attack Republicans and fortify the Democratic Party. That is what the left has become, and they know it. And that's why all that's left for them to do is do things like talk about your personality and occasionally mine. The only thing she does is like occasionally escalate her rhetoric about Republicans.
Yes.
She'll be like, oh, you're fascist, you're Nazis. She'll like use the words that like, that's zero. That's nothing. That's just being an extra Democrat.
That's right.
I do want to say one thing. Like, I do believe that like AOC was genuinely rattled by what happened at the Capitol. She is the target of right-wing media in a pretty demonizing way. I'm sure it was like unsettling to have these mobs running through the Capitol. You have no idea if they're armed, what their intentions are. I'm sure that was scary. She made it through completely unscathed, not an even tiny little bruise on her body. Every other member of Congress in the Democratic caucus, including Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and others, are equally demonized. And they're fucking over it. They got over it. If you want to be a member of Congress, you can't constantly center your own like lived experiences. You're not there to like center yourself in every drama. If you have an opportunity to strike a blow against Wall Street and the massive inequality and suffering that it causes, you don't have the right to refuse to do that because you're like angry and irritated by one of your colleagues. That's not what you're there for. That's like what high school is for. So I do want to just note, I believe that she was like genuinely alarmed by what happened, but it's time for her to move past that.
He viciously attacked her, mimicking her, talking in a baby voice, saying, oh, I was so hurt. And he says, well, she didn't even have a scratch on her, so she couldn't have been hurt. This is a age-old response to men about violence against women. If a woman says she's raped, but she doesn't have grave bodily injury, she's considered to be possibly lying or surely lying. So if you have to have an injury and she didn't have an injury, then she didn't have a trauma. She didn't have a horrible fright. She wasn't terrorized. None of that without being hurt.
His argument was just so absurd that I mean, and of course, a lot of people immediately recognized the absurdity of the idea that there was going to be some alliance of Ted Cruz with progressive Democrats over regulating Wall Street after Ted Cruz is one of the most fascist members of the U.S. Senate and was in many ways part of this movement that led to this fascist riot. The idea that there was going to be some opening for them to regulate Wall Street just because of like one errant tweet that Ted Cruz had sent. And then the idea that the GameStop issue was some kind of progressive opening for like leftist critiques of something. I don't know what.
Capitalism.
Yeah, I guess somehow like the bunch of people on Reddit like driving up a stock price as some like leftist protest that's going to like bring down capitalism or something. I don't know. And none of it really like holds together. It seemed clear that he has some other, well, he has a certain orientation around politics that is like really tied up in nonsense, and his brain, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. A doesn't lead to B, and B doesn't lead to C, but somehow it makes sense in his head, and it makes sense for him that he should like make all these degrading comments about AOC on.
I actually think it makes some sense. The Ted Cruz thing was just a hook to hang on his rage and rant on.
Well, you explain it to me, because I can't follow the logic in it really.
The underlying logic, which he didn't really make clear, but I think he says, is this was an opportunity to create a movement, and it wouldn't be a progressive movement as you and I think of it. Okay, it would be an anti-establishment coming together of anti-establishment progressives and white supremacists and other anti-establishment types, all to attack the neoliberal establishment, the Democratic Party establishment, the Republican Party establishment. That's the unity that he wants. And he said AOC at one time seemed to be part of this, and now she's just becoming part of the Democratic Party. And he's like profoundly disappointed and enraged and like all the rest. I don't know if it was the most coherent presentation of that argument, but that is very clear to me that that's what he was saying. She, in one fell swoop, put an end to this movement that was a movement of left and right together, and that's what he was looking for against Wall Street, against the establishment, against the Democratic Party.
The movement that you're referring to was just the fact that people on both sides of the aisle were both interested in playing to the pro-Reddit GameStop crowd?
No, I think he means that is the movement. The online voices, on the right and the left, the common people, so to speak, who, were uniting against the hedge funds.
I see.
He does call it a movement, but there wasn't a movement.
The whole like two sides cheering at a football game is basically, he's just trying to dismiss this fascism versus people who don't want to be killed by fascists division in our country as some sort of irrelevant culture war that we can just ignore, and it'll disappear if we just work on purely economic populist issues like regulating hedge funds.
And even worse, what he's against is suddenly the two camps divide again. What he was celebrating and what he wanted to continue was the two camps uniting.
Yeah.
Okay, and they were, in a certain sense, and it's not about Ted Cruz. The two camps were uniting around this GameStop hedge fund short selling stuff. And she went and said, my safety and the future of democracy in this country is more important than the kind of politics that Glenn Greenwald and Marjorie Taylor Greenwald represent. So
yeah.
So Greenwald is like saying, she's not the real minority person, right? Omar and Tlaib are the real ones because they suck it up and didn't talk about it, although they did. Tlaib talked about it on the House floor, being terrified. But that's what he's saying. So she's just a feminist is what he's implying. This is not what he said. But we're not interested in your feminism. You may remember a couple months ago, she took it to the House floor that she was harassed in a sexist way by another member of the House outside on the steps. And it was unheard of to bring up something like that. But, these feminists believe these matters are not personal. They are political. And Greenwald, because of his views that only economic issues are important, is, of course, denigrating anything feminist, ignoring other things like racism. But no one would dare say, oh, the Black Lives Matter people weren't even hurt in that demonstration. Why are they complaining? Other black people aren't complaining. That's equivalent. But you can still get away with that in some sectors of the so-called left. And that's what I find most shocking of all.
And there's a recent history to this, because the kind of people who dismissed the resistance to Trumpism, who poo-pooed it and said Trump is a distraction, they constantly made fun of and disparaged the profound fear that tens of millions of people in this country, and many more around the world, felt about Trump coming to power, and the profound stress and fear that have continued until Trump lost the election, but even since, right? Because the threat is not gone. What they've basically done to all of us for years now is tell us to suck it up, get over it, and unite behind their politics. They've been doing this for a very long time, is what I want to say. And it's really horrible in this case to say, there's not a scratch on her body, so she wasn't harmed.
We've talked a lot about the sort of economic populism of like the Jacobinite crowd, the Social Democrats, and them pursuing a type of politics that really marginalizes what they dismiss as cultural issues, what other people might call the fight against sexism and racism and other oppressions. But they're constantly trying to frame what left is by ignoring people's struggles for freedom, equality, dignity, and only framing leftism as being something that is centered around, really centered in reformist, populist, economic issues.
What you say about Greenwald is true, and that he represents a certain strand of pseudo-leftism that thinks because of their economic determinism that everything else is unimportant. But there's a particularity to this attack on a woman who was terrorized for being weak and exaggerating and possibly lying, and get over it. You weren't hurt because you have no physical evidence of being hurt. These are all things that are directed at women all the time. And a reporter named Jill Filipovic, Substack is her blog, wrote a piece, Who We Believe, on February 2, and she discusses this. She takes this apart, and she says there are two different kinds of choosing not to believe. Men who don't believe because it allows them to avoid consequences, and there are women who don't believe because they're asking for consequences, responsibility, and culpability. And what she means by the latter is you can't just tell people to get over it, because one shouldn't get over it without some consequences, responsibility, and culpability. In other words, unless we deal with these attitudes, they're never going to change, just as we need to punish Trump so it won't happen again. We need to denounce this kind of sexism, or it'll just keep going on and on forever. She points out that these same people who denigrate what AOC said as irrelevant, she talked about women in the resistance, which if you read our web journal with Sober Senses, you'll see we've talked for a very long time about the resistance being the major force that could bring down Trumpism, and specifically the role of women and the women's marches and all the other organizations in which women are dominant, or at least make up good half of it, but very often leaders and dominating these movements. These women in the resistance, the whole resistance is generally, frequently denigrated by this type of leftist also, the anti-neoliberals who don't want to talk about anything except income inequality and such. And she points out that women in the resistance are the most organized force against Trump, and the group that has been most consistently correct about him and the threat he posed has been wholly denigrated, largely ignored, and successfully caricatured into an embarrassing joke These are the, quote, middle-aged wine moms of the resistance. Well, this was all a quote. So it all comes together in your attitude towards Trump, as well as your attitudes towards women. These are great, big, overlapping issues, not only because the right-wing Trumpists want to go back to some golden age of America in which women stayed in the kitchen, but because they're all afraid of the power of women, and it's their energy and creativity that has been most damaging to Trumpism. Let me add this. Michael Tracy is another person who attacked her. His blasts are described in a Newsweek article by Sharon Morris, February 2, who says, quotes Tracy's, quote, good to know that any loopy delusion expounded by a politician must now be respected and believed under the aegis of trauma. He said the AOC video is a, quote, masterclass in emotional manipulation, a genuine political/rhetorical skill. Gotta hand it to her, close quote. So again, women are just emotional. There's no logic to anything they do. It's not political. That's these folks' main problem, is how they define political. They mean in support of their politics. They liked her when she was talking about inequality, but not if she's talking about sexism.
This critique of AOC's comments as being, not political because they were personal. I like the way you summarized that, the problems with that, Anne. I think it's important to bring forward. It has to do with people having a very narrow definition of what constitutes political or leftist thinking, and that the part of that construct of criticizing her because of she was expressing vulnerability or talking from personal experience, that there's something actually very important and political about that in itself that should be praised. And a lot of people praised her comments because of that, because she was sort of expressing vulnerability, and it takes a lot of courage as a public figure to do that.
I see what were the House managers doing in the trial of Trump for impeachment. They showed all these videos and quoted all these people who were scared and who were injured. And that was okay. That was considered political. So I object to, well, it's good to show your vulnerability. That's not what she was doing. She was trying to get across how very real her trauma was, and that it can't just be dismissed, and you can't just tell the women to get over trauma that's connected with sexual assault. In her mind, this was connected with sexual assault, whereas they would have hanged Mike Pence if they'd found him. Who knows what they would have done to her and to Nancy Pelosi, possibly something having to do with rape and women's particular vulnerability. So it's a slightly different point from just making the experience real through describing it. It's the particularity of sexism that I think needs a whole lot more discussion, because it's really unbelievable in this day and age that Greenwald could ever, anytime, get away with calling himself a leftist. A lot of people have denounced him. People have said he's no leftist. He never was, or he wasn't in the last few years. He's full of baloney. But the fact that we had to have this serious discussion in major left media, Newsweek isn't even left, it's major news. Why do we have to have that? 50 years after I thought the women's liberation movement had disposed of the argument that women's issues, quote, women's issues are not important. Economic issues are the only important ones. Now, I realize that for Greenwald and these others, there's a very good motivation. They probably don't even believe their own baloney.
No, how could Greenwald possibly believe that because there was no physical damage on her body that she was not harmed and nothing happened to her? He can't possibly believe this. The man lives in Rio de Janeiro, where the entire middle class and upper middle class population is continually in fear, and they live behind walls with barbed wire and so forth. So he doesn't believe this for a second.
But he thought it would resonate because of something there in left culture. So he thought it was okay to say it. That's the point.
Absolutely. That is exactly the point.
He sounds like he believes it. He's so upset that she's ruined this wonderful alliance with Ted Cruz, which never existed.
Hey, before we continue with this conversation, we are going to take just a minute to tell you about Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it, as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
Yeah, so in preparation for this episode, we've looked at a lot of the commentary around, in particular, what Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore said on Greenwald said it on Jimmy Dore's program, also regarding Michael Tracy, also regarding some of those kinds of people's backlash against AOC even prior to this intervention by Greenwald in the AOC video. So among the pieces we looked at are the piece by Jill Filipovic that Anne was discussing in the Substack on February 2, Jeet Here in the Nation on February 3, Jacobin, interestingly, Lici D'Amelio wrote on February 8th in Jacobin about AOC and Greenwald and stuff, Ashley Reese in Jezebel on February 4, the Saren Morris article that Anne made reference to, and also this is prior to the AOC video, there was a piece by Eric Levitz in New York's The Intelligencer. And, you know, as we've discussed earlier in this segment, some of these folks just sort of accept this characterization of Greenwald as a leftist, Jeet Here in the Nation, and D'Amelio in Jacobin. But other people, you know, are not accepting this, as we've talked about. The piece by Ashley Reese in Jezebel calls him a post-left cynic. And there's much else going around where people are calling the characterization of Greenwald as a leftist, they're calling that into question, and that's welcome, and it's a long time in coming. Nothing that we came across really was in support of Greenwald or Dorr and so forth. We're ignoring Twitter comments and stuff. Real substantive pieces are what we're referring to here. But so much of the criticism was on very limited, narrow grounds. There was like a lot of focus on Greenwald's allegedly naive belief that Ted Cruz's offer of collaboration was in good faith. And I actually don't think that personally that Greenwald thinks that it was in good faith. I think he was just looking for a hook to hang on his thing that the left and right should have come together. Okay, but even so, there was this idea that he tactically miscalculated by believing in Ted Cruz's offer of collaboration. And then there's other commentary, a lot of which focuses on tactical disagreement with various tactical proposals coming from that camp. In other words, they were saying that AOC and other progressives should have forced a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives to get Medicare for all. They should not have voted for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker until she agreed to the House floor. Other people are pushing back against that tactical assessment. And then a lot of the commentary focuses on specific factual claims. Jeet here goes after Glenn Greenwald's comment that Omar and Tlaib are, quote, fucking over it. Ashley Reese goes against Dorr's equation of AOC and Adam Schiff. And there's also what we saw was a lot of a defense of AOC's style, earnest and emotional, and so forth. And that's not wholly irrelevant because she's a woman and it goes to certain issues of sexism, but that's really a limited way of dealing with the issue of sexism here. I thought that if you really want a good piece on the sexism, read Jill Filipovich's article, which does not go into issues of style and emotion, and listen to what Anne's saying, frankly. But that was really the sum and substance of the critique that we're seeing about what Greenwald and his ilk have done. Here in The Nation, D'Amelio and Jacobin completely ignore the issue of the sexism in Greenwald's attack, and none of these pieces criticizes or challenges what it seems to me to be motivating everything that Greenwald is doing, which is his left firstism, his belief that the main goal is for the left to win political power. So this is no longer Marx's liberatory vision of the masses controlling society. It's all about we, the left, gaining power and wresting power from the establishment, including and especially what's standing in our way on the left, the mainstream Democrats. So nobody is bringing that into the mix as why Greenwald is doing this. None of them are criticizing the two things that directly follow from Greenwald's left firstism. His prioritization of fighting against the mainstream Democratic Party, and amazingly to me, the red-brown collaborationism, his idea that the anti-establishment left should unite with the alt-right against the establishment. That's like pervading everything he says against AOC in his rant. People did not comment on it. So they just don't seem to recognize that the attack on AOC is firmly rooted in Greenwald's left firstism, his desire to fight the Democratic Party and collude with the far right. For instance, Reese, who wrote a fairly good piece in Jezebel, she basically ascribed the online attack against AOC, not Greenwald specifically, to an overreaction against identity politics. But it's not just an overreaction against identity politics. Greenwald's got a lot of followers. Jimmy Dore's got, I don't know, 800,000 subscribers, followers, whatever it might be. There are people who back that kind of politics. They're not insignificant. And so it's not just overreaction against identity politics. It's wanting the left to have political power and making that the issue against prioritizing anything else, the fight against Trumpism, the issue of Black lives, and so forth. And in the main, a lot of these pieces just don't raise the issue of how can you call what these people are doing, where we get the red-brown collaborationism front and center blaring at us. How can you call that leftism? A couple of the pieces do that. Jill Filipovich's piece doesn't say that in terms of a category, but it's really about horrible kind of politics that is being represented by these attacks on AOC. To some extent, Ashley Reese raises this issue of how do we define the left? What is the meaning of it, of saying this is on the left? She says the left should be reminded that sexism and racism are part of what they claim to fight against. And that's, of course, missing from Greenwald and his ilk. But those were exceptions. And so you can not like the fact that Greenwald went too far, but Greenwald went too far because it flows from his politics, his political orientation, his goals. And that's, I think, what the left has to reject in favor of Marx's liberatory conception of a new society and of the struggle for that.
I think, we could discuss this all day and in more depth, and particularly the thing Andrew closed with, that it's not Marxist liberatory theory, because we still sound like we're falling into some kind of a binary, a choice that you have to make. Are you a feminist? Do you work in feminist things? Or are you a leftist in which you work in economic things? That's what has to be completely smashed as a concept of left, and we're always trying to do that in MHI to break that down and expose it. So I don't like the term that Greenwald went too far, bending the stick or whatever. He's a sexist pig, and we can't put up with sexist pigs anymore. We've had 50 years of women's liberation movement. We were supposed to be over this kind of stuff, and many things have changed, but many things have not. And to anyone to call this leftism or to cheer on these guys when they say these things and make fun of AOC is absolutely disgraceful and should be denounced from the rafters by any other form of left, and should not be pigeonholed as, well, this is a woman's issue, or this is for the women's movement to deal with. And I can't emphasize that too much.
And you've made a couple different references to the women's movement 50 years ago. Can you want to expand on that?
Sure. When what's called the second wave of women's liberation emerged in the late 60s, early 70s, this was long before the recent anti-rape and anti-sexual harassment movements began. Those issues were, of course, central to the movement, and that women were so routinely mistreated. But it wasn't all there was to the movement. Women were raising all kinds of issues on every front, from housework to paid labor to respect, to just every aspect of life. They had a very different vision of what society should be. And this was particularly true of women in the anti-war movement, the Black liberation movement, the student movement, the left, such as it was. Women came out of those movements, criticizing those movements and forming their own organizations and movements in which they would not have to play a subsidiary role. Women used to make the coffee, and men did the thinking and writing and speech making, and the women had a vision of a different kind of society that they talked about, that wasn't just in a background thing like the left today. Oh, someday we'll have a revolution and we'll have change in work relations and human relations. No, this was front and central with the women, and that's what made the new movement so profound. As Dostoevskaya put it in her many writings on the movement and on women's liberation, it was because they came out of the left and turned against the left as it was, that they could make great strides in ideas about freedom as well as the specific changes they were working for. But it was not an easy process. For example, I attended an international student conference in the summer of 1968. It was held at Columbia University, and I still remember it because was, frankly, I was shocked and traumatized by what happened there, even though I was only in the audience. But they had invited one woman to speak about the then very new women's movement. And she started to speak, and she was hooted off the stage for talking about women's liberation. She was literally not allowed to finish. She was chased away. You don't think anyone would do that today, and yet here is this pseudo-leftist Greenwald sounding exactly like Trump, and he's not the only one.
I mean, a lot of the left knows that it's got to be intersectional. So when you've got your anti-neoliberal conferences and you get women speakers and they talk about, quote, women's issues, close quote, and they manage somehow to rivet that to the anti-neoliberal struggle, everybody is now very fine with that. What they're not fine with is critique coming from within the left. You know, as Anne pointed out, that part has not changed.
We attended a conference about 2.5 years ago that was put on by Historical Materialism and Jacobin, that was the co-sponsors. And we spoke on some panels, but not this one on women's reproductive rights. That was Jacobin people. And they spoke about the threats to abortion rights and the solutions that women were coming up with, the importance of medical abortions so that you didn't need surgery and that sort of thing. And not once did they mention Trump or the role he was playing. And I got up and said, excuse me, we have to talk about Trump leading and allowing and encouraging a massive assault on women's right to choose and women's reproductive freedom. And they tried to shut me up, literally. They said, oh, that's not important, change the subject. So there is still this fake division. So, and it's things like this, of course, that drive women away from looking at leftist organizations and going just to feminist organizations. And it's a real crime in my view. We need to talk a lot more about the integrality of these things with Marxism, women's rights with Marxism.
And about, you were talking about it like a half century ago. I mean, one issue at the time was the men in the left stood up and gave speeches, and the women ran the mimeo machines, which was the way they would produce documents back then. They would make coffee and so forth. How does the situation then compare to the situation now in terms of women's leadership on the left, do you think?
Oh, there have been a lot of changes. Nobody would dare say, the women have to do the manual labor and the men do the thinking and writing and speaking. No one would say it. And they generally, organizations in the last 40 years or so, they do share the manual work. But we still have the men in the leadership and giving the speeches most of the time in what are called left organizations that have socialist in their name or Marxist or something like that. In many movement organizations, there's nothing like that. There are women in the leadership and often in the majority of the movement itself, in the resistance movements, in the anti-Trump, the women's march movements that went on for 4 years, and in all kinds of other movements, climate change, anti-gun movements, other youth movements, heavily women. They're doing very important and profound work, but it's not that kind of unity that I'm looking for, that I was speaking about, where the grassroots activity is explicitly contributing to theoretical development and the ideas of Marx for a totally new society are tied together explicitly and worked out together explicitly. And it's the working out that constitutes the movement's own self-development towards revolutionary change and really creating a new society. Nobody talks about creating a new society except MHI anymore. because it's so far off the agenda of most of the pseudo-left. The most they can hope for is taking over the Democratic Party or putting economic issues further front, or they think they're going to reform Wall Street. What a joke. The capitalists are not going to give up Wall Street. It has an important function.
Most of the left, though, is not as women-hating as Glenn Greenwald. I mean, apart from people like him, why do you think that there's this continuing problem of, in self-identified left groups, why do you think there's this continuing problem that there's so few women in leadership?
Oh, well, part of it is the left is part of the larger society, and we are so far away from uprooting sexism in the larger society that even though young men are generally not the sexist pigs they were in my youth, they've been raised by feminist mothers, and you don't normally have that kind of automatic sexism. Oh, you can't play with me because you're a girl. You don't have that, but you have still much sexism embedded in the society. And we also have the reaction against the women's movement and all the reforms of the 1960s on. We have the total reactionary theories being evinced by the Trump supporters, where women are just denigrated. And I'm constantly shocked to see that there's still so much gross and unapologetic misogyny, such as the rape culture among groups of athletes and high school and college boys and men. There's still all kinds of assaults are accepted, and there's still all kinds of issues around sex and what's consensual sex, and huge pressure on young women to sleep with guys who show any interest in them. I'm sorry, you asked about the left. There's also few women in the leadership of the so-called Marxist organizations, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One is that many women choose to go into feminist organizations. Instead, the issues are more immediately in need of, they think, of their participation. But also, I think there's sort of a sexist culture, what actually I deemed to myself, thinking about this, a sexist system akin to a racist system, and the beliefs and traditions of left organizations that are basically hierarchical. I don't mean that the men go in and grab power and the women are nicer. I mean the actual structure and functioning of many left organizations, where men are in the leadership because they've studied more Marx or Lenin or whatever, and so they become the experts and the leaders. And the women perform supportive roles, if not only making coffee, they're still not in that leadership. And I attribute that to the basically hierarchical structure and the very concept of organization that dominates the left. We have, in MHI, we have a whole different concept of organization, but we're still working on it. We don't think it's been spelled out ever. And certainly it can't be hierarchical in that sense of who does the intellectual work and who does the supportive work. Much of the left still goes along with their party form. They've got a hierarchical structure. They're going to lead the masses. They have to discipline their own members to follow the leaders. And it's a very, very sexist culture there. And that's another kind of systemic sexism, one that's, I think, particular to the left.
That's all the time we have for this episode. It was great to have Andrea Card with us again on the podcast today. She is always very insightful on whatever she's speaking about. Maybe we'll have her back again soon to talk about the history of the women's movement.
I enjoyed getting to rant and rave about Glenn Greenwald and them, so I enjoyed the discussion too.
If you like the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe, to write to us, to share it with friends, to rate the podcast, and all those other good things. To learn more about these issues or others discussed on Radio Free Humanity, please do visit Marxist-Humanist Initiative.org.